All right, we are diving into a mystery that connects an ancient, legendary myth with one of the absolute most remote places on Earth. We're asking a pretty wild question today. Could the lost continent of Mu actually be buried under all that ice in Antarctica?
You know, the idea of a lost, super advanced civilization, it's one of those stories that just never gets old. But what if the ruins of that world aren't sitting at the bottom of the ocean? What if they're buried deep, deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet? I know, it sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie, but believe it or not, it's a theory that gets debated pretty hotly in alternative history circles.
So, before we head all the way to the South Pole, let's just do a quick recap of the story most people already know, the classic legend of the lost continent of Mu. Where did this whole idea even come from in the first place?
Okay, so the standard story, the one that really took off, was popularized by a writer named James Churchward way back in the early 20th century, and he placed Mu smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. He described it as this amazing tropical paradise, basically the cradle of all human civilization. In his version of the story, this was ground zero for humanity, and any survivors from its sinking are said to have become the ancestors of the indigenous cultures you find along the Pacific coasts. Churchwood claimed it was a massive landmass, stretching from the Marianas clean over to Easter Island before some catastrophe sent it sinking beneath the waves. But what if Churchward, and pretty much everyone else, was looking in the completely wrong ocean? This is where our story takes a really sharp turn south. And I mean a very, very cold turn south.
So here's the deal. We're kind of leaving the original legend behind now and going way down the rabbit hole into more speculative stuff. This isn't really about the classic Mu story anymore. It's about how different threads from fringe history and old esoteric lore get tangled together. Specifically, how the story of Mu gets mixed up with that other famous lost continent, Atlantis. And that brings us to this really radical idea that just changes the entire game. Forget the warm Pacific waters. This new theory suggests that if Mu ever existed, its remains aren't lost. They're just preserved in the coldest place on the entire planet. But, I mean, how could that even be possible?
Well, the logic here really hangs on two key and pretty speculative ideas that try to explain how a warm, inhabited continent could possibly end up at the South Pole. Let's break them down one by one.
First up, you've got the pole shift theory. This is a biggie in these conversations. The basic idea is that the Earth's crust could have suddenly and violently just slipped. It would have dragged entire continents to brand new locations in, like, a geological instant. And in that kind of scenario, a continent that was once in a nice temperate zone could get slammed into a polar region and basically get flash frozen.
Okay, the second big idea comes from researchers like Graham Hancock. Now, he's put forward this theory that a highly advanced global civilization existed way before our recorded history, but it was wiped out by a massive cataclysm right at the end of the last ice age, something like 12,000 years ago. He's even suggested that Antarctica, which might not have been completely covered in ice back then, could be the very place that holds the remains of this lost world.
So the proposed timeline here is just catastrophic. First, some kind of global disaster. Maybe a comet hits, maybe a pole shift happens, and it destroys this ancient civilization. Its cities, now located at the South Pole, get rapidly buried under miles and miles of ice. And today, all that evidence, everything they left behind, could still be there, perfectly preserved in a deep freeze, just waiting for someone to find it. So, let's try and tie all these threads together, right? We've got the myth of Mu, the myth of Atlantis, the pole shift theory, and this idea of a lost ice age civilization. So what happens when you mash them all together? Okay, here's the final leap in logic. In a lot of these esoteric traditions, Mu and Atlantis aren't two totally separate stories. They're seen as two parts of the same ancient global supercivilization. Think of them as sister empires. So, if a pole shift sent Atlantis to the South Pole, well, it stands to reason that remnants of its sister civilization, Mu, could be right there with it. And just like that, Antarctica stops being a barren wasteland and turns into a potential tomb for a whole lost chapter of human history. And this is exactly why, for people who believe this, Antarctica is the perfect, untouched vault. I mean, if you wanted to hide the remains of a lost supercontinent, you couldn't design a better place. It's remote, it's almost impossible to get to, and it's perfectly preserved. It's not just a continent at that point, it's the ultimate archaeological prize. And all of this leaves us with one final, just tantalizing question. While mainstream science keeps doing its amazing work, studying ice cores and geology, these fringe theories are asking us to imagine something.
More. What if the single greatest discovery in all of human history isn't waiting for us out in space, but is actually buried deep beneath our own feet at the very bottom of the world?